Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Costantinu, and I would like to thank also all the organizers for this meeting to invite me to come and give this talk here. It's definitely an honor and a pleasure to be here today. So as Dr. Costantinu mentioned, I'll be speaking on biologics in EoE, applied and promising research treatments. As Dr. Costantinu mentioned, I do work at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City. I'm there. I serve as the professor of pediatrics and medicine, and I'm also the founding director of the Mount Sinai Center for Eosinophilic Disorders there. This is where I work. What you're looking at is a picture taken in the late afternoon. So the sun is setting to the west. This is Central Park here in the background. And in the foreground, you could see the Mount Sinai complex, where I've established the Mount Sinai Center for Eosinophilic Disorders back in 2007. And we've been really busy since then, providing clinical care as well as research advances for patients with eosinophilic gastrointestinal disorders, including EoE. Before I start my talk, these are my disclosures. I do provide or do receive consultant fees as well as research funding from several pharmaceutical companies. So I will be sticking to what's published in the literature and what is in the public domain. So I do not create any conflicts of interest for this talk. Before I discuss all the biologics that are emerging now for EoE, I'd like to go over very briefly the immunopathology of EoE. Dr. Costantinu did a marvelous job describing the immunopathology in way more details, so I will be very brief here. So in summary, food allergens or environmental allergens trigger the esophageal epithelium to secrete alarmins such as TSLP, IL-25, and IL-33. And this drives the immune pathway towards an aberrant type 2 allergic response. So now you have the allergic cytokines, IL-4, IL-5, and IL-13, which, along with pro-inflammatory mediators, invite or drive the eosinophilic infiltration into the esophagus, as well as other inflammatory cells. In addition, IgE stimulates granulocyte degranulation, which releases more of these pro-inflammatory mediators, which create a positive feedback loop. So this results overall in the chronic infiltration of inflammatory cells in the esophageal mucosa, which causes eventually esophageal remodeling and esophageal fibrosis. Luckily, there are multiple biologics that are currently being tested to address or that target several of these drivers of the immunopathogenic chain. And what I'll be doing is going over the various targets and what biologics have been tested or are currently being tested targeting those molecules. Starting with IL-13 as a target, there are two biologics that were tested that targeting IL-13. One is QAX576, and the second one is RPC4046, also known as cendakimab. So regarding QAX576, it was tested a few years ago now out of Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States, in a randomized, placebo-controlled, single-center study where 3 infusions of the biologic resulted in a trend towards clinical and histological improvement. Regarding cendakimab, or RPC4046, it was tested in a much larger study. This was a multi-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 2 trial that was tested in adult patients with EoE. So the study included 99 EoE patients, ages 18 to 65 years. Patients were randomized into 2 doses of cendakimab, a low dose of 180 milligrams subcutaneously weekly, and versus a high dose of 360 milligrams subcutaneously weekly versus placebo. And after 16 weeks of treatment, Clinically, the mean change in the dysphagia symptom score was significantly higher in those that received the high dose of cendakimab compared to those that received low dose or placebo. Histologically, there was a significant reduction in the peak esophageal eosinophil count using both doses of cendakimab compared to placebo. An open-label extension on the same patients using the higher dose of 360 milligrams subcutaneously weekly through 52 weeks resulted in sustained clinical and histological improvement. These encouraging results have led to the development of a phase 3 trial that is currently ongoing. So this is a multi-center double-blind placebo-controlled trial where the 360 milligrams subcutaneously weekly is being used for induction and then followed by every other weeks as a maintenance treatment in one arm versus 360 milligrams subcutaneously weekly throughout initiation and maintenance treatment versus placebo. And if you need to know more information, this is the clinical trial number. How about other allergic cytokines as targets? Dupilumab is another biologic that targets IL-4 and IL-13. So dupilumab, as almost all of you know, is an antibody that targets the IL-4 receptor alpha, which in turn blocks the secretion of IL-4 and IL-13. Its use was early on in a phase 2 trial in adult patients with EoE. This was a multi-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial that included 47 EoE patients, ages 18 to 65 years, that were randomized into receiving either dupilumab 300 milligrams subcutaneously weekly versus placebo. And after 12 weeks of treatment, clinically, the mean change from baseline in the dysphagia symptom score was significantly higher in those that received dupilumab compared to placebo. And histologically, the mean percentage change from baseline in peak esophageal eosinophil counts was higher in those that received dupilumab compared to placebo. Since these changes were significantly different, these promising results led to development of a phase 3 trial in both adolescent and adults with EoE. So the trial is, again, a multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that included EoE patients 12 years and above. This time they were randomized into 3 arms, one of 3 arms. Dupilumab 300 milligrams subcutaneously weekly, so that's the same dose as the phase 2, versus 300 milligrams subcutaneously every other week, which is the dose that you are used to see for the other atopic indications versus placebo. And the treatment duration was 24 weeks. Now, the results from this trial have not been published yet. However, a press release that was out by the sponsors very recently showed a significant clinical and histological improvements. So if we look at the data from their press release, in terms of percent reduction of symptoms from baseline, the patients that received dupilumab in both Part A and Part B of the study had significantly higher percent reduction in their symptoms compared to the placebo. And histologically, the percent of patients that reached deep histological remission was also significantly higher in those that received dupilumab compared to placebo. And these results have led to the FDA approval of the weekly dosing of dupilumab for patients with EoE 12 years and above 5 months ago. How about children? And children are not left behind here. There's currently a multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that included EoE patients less than 12 years of age, and patients were randomized into one of 3 arms: high-dose dupilumab, low-dose dupilumab versus placebo. This was a weight-based treatment, and the duration of treatment was for 16 weeks. Again, no data is published yet, but a press release by the sponsors literally a month ago, showed significant histological and endoscopic improvement in those that received the biologic. So if we look at the details, the percent reduction in peak esophageal eosinophil count was 86% in those that received high-dose dupilumab compared to 21% in placebo. Similarly, the change in the histological severity and extent scores was significantly higher in those that received dupilumab compared to placebo. Endoscopically, the change in the endoscopic score was also significantly better in those that received the drug compared to placebo. And clinically, the one clinical criterion that was examined in detail was the change in body weight for age percentile. And there was improvement in those that received dupilumab compared to minimal to no improvement in the placebo group. Taking on other targets here, the second one, if we move to, is IL-5. And for IL-5, 2 biologics have been tested so far, namely mepolizumab and reslizumab. Starting with mepolizumab, it was first tested many years ago now in a single-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled fashion back in Switzerland. And that study involved 11 EoE patients that were randomized into receiving mepolizumab 750 milligrams IV monthly versus placebo. Patients received 2 infusions 4 weeks apart. Although the drop histologically in peak esophageal eosinophils was more significant for those that received mepolizumab compared to placebo, none of the patients that received mepolizumab achieved histological remission. If we look at the clinical symptoms, in terms of the mild improvement in dysphagia score, both groups had mild changes that were not statistically significant. Mepolizumab was later on, very shortly after, studied in a much larger study in children with EoE. This was a multi-center randomized double-blind parallel group study that included 59 children with EoE that were randomized into one of three mepolizumab arms, 0.55, 2.5, and 10 milligrams per kilogram IV monthly. No placebo arm was there. Patients received 3 infusions 4 weeks apart. Now, a third, when we look at the histological data, a third of the patients that received mepolizumab achieved a peak esophageal count of less than 20 per high-power field. And the drop in the peak esophageal eosinophils was more significant in the 2.5 milligram per kilogram group. Clinically, however, no clinical improvement was seen using mepolizumab. There could be a problem here in this study is that at study entry, many of the patients had minimal to no symptoms. So it was very hard to show an improvement in symptoms, even if it was meant to occur. So we don't know how much the study design affected those results. As for reslizumab, another anti-IL-5 antibody, it was tested shortly after, again in children with EoE this time, multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that included a much larger number of patients. This time it was 226 children with EoE that were randomized into one of 3 doses of reslizumab, 1 milligram, 2 milligram, or 3 milligrams per kilogram IV monthly versus placebo. Patients received 4 infusions 4 weeks apart. Histologically, patients showed a drop in the peak esophageal count using all 3 doses of reslizumab as opposed to placebo. Clinically, however, all groups showed an improvement in clinical symptoms as judged by the physician's global assessment score, and the results were comparable between reslizumab patients and placebo. So the results of both of these, or all of these trials using both biologics, since none of them met the clinical outcome, they were dropped eventually from further studies for EoE. Moving on to another potential target here in the pathogenesis of EoE are the eosinophils. So for those, 2 biologics have been tested. One is lirentelimab, and the second one is benralizumab. Starting with lirentelimab, it is a monoclonal antibody against Siglec-8. Siglec-8 is present on the surface of eosinophils and mast cells. So the way the antibody worked is by antibody-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity, and also there's inhibition of mast cells with that antibody. This was a multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 2/3 trial that involved EoE patients 12 years and above, so 12 to 80 years of age. They were randomized into 2 doses of lirentelimab, a high dose where they started with 1 milligram per kilogram with the first dose, followed by 3 milligrams per kilogram IV monthly, or a low dose of lirentelimab that consisted of 1 milligram per kilogram IV monthly throughout versus placebo. Treatment duration was also 24 weeks. And just like with many of the biologics I described, no results are published yet, but again, we do have a press release from the sponsor showing significant histological improvement with high dose and low dose lirentelimab, as you could see here in the table, but comparable clinical results. So the absolute mean change in the dysphagia score was comparable in the lirentelimab group compared to placebo. The second biologic that targets eosinophils, as I mentioned, is another monoclonal antibody against this time the IL-5 receptor alpha, and that's benralizumab. This is a multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 trial that was recently conducted in EoE patients 12 to 65 years of age. Patients were randomized into either receiving benralizumab or placebo subcutaneously, and the treatment duration is 24 weeks. The study just finished enrollment and no data has been released yet. So the list of biologics luckily does not stop there, as there are many other promising biologics that can be used for eosinophilic esophagitis. And here I'm just giving you 3 examples based on some evidence in the medical literature. So the first one being vedolizumab, which is an antibody against alpha-4 beta-7. And the evidence here is based on 2 case reports showing both histological and clinical improvement. These are patients with inflammatory bowel disease that happen to have concurrent EoE and were treated with that antibody. The second biologic is tofacitinib, which is a Janus kinase inhibitor, and this is based on 1 case report showing histological and clinical improvement. The third antibody, which I've heard a lot being discussed during this meeting, and that's tezepelumab, which is a monoclonal antibody against TSLP. There's no data available yet in patients with EoE. However, we do know that TSLP is overexpressed in the esophagus of many patients with EoE. So finally, biologics for EoE, which patients are ideal candidates? Now, as you've seen so far from my brief overview here, none of the biologics have been FDA approved for EoE except for 1 so far, which is dupilumab, and none are EMA approved for EoE. So we do not know yet, as there are no guidelines as to where do you place biologics in the treatment algorithm for patients with EoE. So these are potential scenarios that I've listed on these slides, which are purely based on my opinion and clinical experience, and they are not data-driven. So potential scenarios I could think of are patients refractory to standard of care therapies. For example, patients not responding to diet or not responding to topical corticosteroids. Another scenario could be patients with side effects to standard care therapies. So these are patients who are doing okay, but they're dealing with side effects from drugs. For example, recurrent candida esophagitis requiring antifungal treatment from chronic use of topical corticosteroids. Adrenal suppression from topical corticosteroids at high dose. And another example is severely reduced quality of life from a restricted diet. A third scenario could be patients with comorbidities with similar immunopathology to EoE. For example, using dupilumab in a patient that has concurrent asthma, allergic rhinitis, and or atopic dermatitis that are dependent on chronic steroids or topical steroids or are difficult to control. And finally, another scenario could be patients that have adherence difficulties to using once daily or twice daily medications, such as when you're using a proton pump inhibitor or a topical corticosteroids. As you saw, all of the biologics are being dosed once every 1 to 4 weeks, so that could be solving the problems to these patients. So to conclude, a few takeaway messages. There's major progress has been made in understanding EoE immunopathology, and therefore many biologics are currently under investigation or hold promise for investigation for EoE with various targets in mind, namely alarmins, type 2 inflammatory cytokines, eosinophils and mast cells, and chemoattractants for lymphocytes and eosinophils. And the good news is one biologic has so far received FDA approval, and that is dupilumab for patients 12 years and above. And what we hope for is that more biologics get FDA approval as well as EMA approval so that they could be used in those patients that need them. Thank you for your attention.